I remember the smell of burnt coffee and paper long before I understood what betrayal really meant. The office was too small for so many adults, yet no one seemed willing to move. 6 relatives filled the room, their voices low and sharp, like broken glass sliding across the floor. I stood near the wall, my fingers pressing into the rough wooden edge of a chair that was too tall for me to sit on comfortably. My shoes barely touched the carpet, but no one noticed. Or maybe they noticed and chose not to care. My mother's voice cut through the noise first. Sharp, cold, decided. She reached down and grabbed my younger sister's hand so quickly that my sister barely had time to protest. My father followed seconds later, placing his firm hand on my brother's shoulder, guiding him toward the door like everything had already been planned. Like I wasn't part of the decision. I watched them move, watched their backs turn, watched their steps become faster, urgent, determined, final. My throat felt dry as I forced the question out. Who am I going with? The words sounded smaller than I expected. Fragile, like they might break before reaching anyone's ears. My father didn't turn, not even halfway. My mother paused for less than a second, just enough to make me believe she might look back, might change her mind. But she didn't. Instead, her voice came out colder than the room itself. He can take care of himself. Then came the silence, 12 seconds. I counted them without meaning to. 1, 2, 3. Each second stretched longer than the last. I waited for footsteps to return, for someone to sigh, to hesitate, to say my name. No one did. 6 relatives stood in that room, all facing me now. Their eyes moved over me like I was an object left behind after everyone else had packed their things. Not one of them stepped forward. Not one of them reached for my hand. Not one of them spoke. And that was when I noticed something strange. The family lawyer, a tall man with thin gray hair, leaned slightly toward my aunt. His voice dropped low, barely louder than a breath. She shouldn't stay on the official record. I didn't fully understand what that meant, but I understood the tone. It wasn't about comfort. It wasn't about care. It was about removal. Minutes later, a woman in a gray suit entered the room. Her shoes clicked softly against the floor, each step measured and controlled. She introduced herself as a social worker, her smile tight and professional, like she had practiced it in front of a mirror. She approached me slowly, crouching until her face, bangs, reached my level. "Hi there," she said gently. Her voice was softer than everyone else's, but it still felt distant, rehearsed, careful. I stared at the door behind her, still waiting, still listening. "Are they coming back?" I asked. The question slipped out before I could stop it. For a moment, she didn't answer. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound followed. Her eyes shifted to the side, avoiding mine, like she needed permission from someone who wasn't there. Then she spoke. "No, not today. Not today." Those 2 words settled into my chest like stones. She reached for my hand, wrapping her fingers around mine. Her touch was warm, but it felt procedural, not comforting, not familiar, like she had done this 100 times before. I allowed her to guide me out of the office. The hallway outside felt longer than it should have been. Every step echoed softly, bouncing off walls that smelled like dust and cleaning solution. I kept turning my head, hoping to hear footsteps behind us, hoping to see someone running back, calling my name. No one did. Later that day, she drove me to a house I had never seen before. The sun had already started lowering in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet street. The house itself looked ordinary: beige siding, small front yard, curtains drawn tightly across the windows. Inside, the air smelled like detergent and old carpet. A woman greeted us at the door. She introduced herself as my foster mother, her smile polite but distant. She spoke kindly, but there was no warmth in her voice, no familiarity, no recognition, just obligation. She led me to a small bedroom at the end of the hallway. The bed was already made, clothes folded neatly on top, none of them mine. A toothbrush sat beside the sink in the bathroom, brand new, untouched. Everything prepared, everything waiting, except family. That night, I sat quietly on the edge of the bed, staring at the ceiling. The silence inside the house felt different from the silence in the office. This silence felt permanent, heavy, unmovable. And that was when I noticed something else. There were no papers on the dresser, no envelope with my parents' signatures, no official documents confirming who I belonged to. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into routine. School registration began shortly after I arrived. One afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table while a caseworker spread my documents across the surface. Papers shuffled softly under her hands as she flipped through them. Then she stopped. Her fingers froze mid-turn. A deep line formed between her eyebrows. She flipped the folder again, slower this time, carefully. "This file," she murmured, mostly to herself. "It's incomplete." The word echoed in my mind. Incomplete. She checked the pages again, her movements becoming more deliberate. Then she stood up and walked into the next room, closing the door halfway behind her. Her voice dropped into a whisper as she made a phone call. I couldn't hear every word, but I heard enough. "Yes, there are missing pages." "No, they're not misfiled." Pause. "It looks intentional." That word stayed with me. Intentional. Later that afternoon, she returned to the table and sat across from me. Her expression had changed. Less confident, more cautious. "There's something unusual about your records," she said carefully. Her fingers tapped lightly against the folder. "Some pages from your file aren't here." She paused, then added quickly, almost defensively. "Sometimes paperwork gets lost." But her voice betrayed her. Her hand trembled slightly as she closed the folder. That night, I lay in bed listening to the quiet sounds of the house settling around me. Distant footsteps, doors closing, muffled voices drifting through walls. Then I heard her again. On the phone. Soft. Urgent. "Yes, it looks like someone removed them intentionally." The words slipped through the hallway like smoke. And for the first time in my life, something cold settled deep inside my chest. Months passed. I stopped asking questions, stopped waiting for letters, stopped expecting birthdays to be remembered. One afternoon, I sat once again inside a social services office. The same beige walls, the same harsh fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the same folder resting on the desk in front of me. The social worker placed her hands flat on the table, studying the papers one final time. Then she looked at me. Not like a child, not like paperwork, but like a puzzle she couldn't solve. "There's something unusual about your file," she said quietly. She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. "Your birth certificate exists." Pause. "But your family name was removed from multiple records." The words didn't make full sense to me yet, but they felt dangerous, heavy, like a truth too large for someone my age to carry. And in that moment, sitting under those buzzing lights, I understood something that would follow me for the rest of my life. I wasn't just abandoned, I had been erased. The first lesson I learned in foster care was how to listen without being seen. The house woke early every morning, not because anyone wanted to, but because routine was the only way to keep order among too many children living under one roof. The sound of footsteps began before sunrise. Soft shuffling in the hallway, doors opening and closing, the hiss of the coffee machine in the kitchen. I learned quickly that silence was safer than questions, safer than needing anything. At breakfast, we sat in a straight line along the long wooden table. Bowls of cereal were passed down without conversation. No one asked how anyone slept. No one checked if anyone was scared. Food was fuel. Nothing more. I watched carefully, studying the way the other children moved. The older ones spoke only when necessary. The younger ones tried harder to be noticed, but attention rarely lasted long enough to matter. One morning, a boy across from me spilled his milk. The sound of the glass hitting the floor cracked through the quiet room. Everyone froze. The foster mother didn't yell. She didn't need to. She simply stared, long and cold, until the boy cleaned the mess himself, his small hands shaking as he wiped the floor with paper towels. That was the moment I understood. Mistakes weren't punished loudly. They were punished silently, and silence hurt more. Weeks passed, and school became my only place to breathe. It wasn't comfortable, but it was predictable. Teachers asked questions with clear answers. Books followed rules that made sense. Numbers stayed numbers. Words stayed words. Unlike adults. I sat in the back of the classroom, watching everything. Memorizing everything. Every detail mattered. Schedules, locker combinations, classroom routines. I didn't want surprises anymore. Surprises meant loss. One afternoon, during a math test, my teacher paused beside my desk. She stood there longer than necessary, watching my pencil move across the paper. When I finished, she picked up my test and scanned it quickly. "You finished early?" she said. I nodded. She looked down again, then back at me. "All correct." Her tone carried surprise, but something else too. Interest. That word felt unfamiliar. Later that week, she asked me to stay after class. I sat stiffly at my desk while the other students packed their bags and rushed toward the door. When the room emptied, she pulled up a chair and sat across from me. "You're very good at solving patterns," she said gently. I didn't respond. Compliments felt dangerous, temporary. She slid a sheet of paper across the desk. "Extra problems. Harder ones. Try these," she said. I stared at the paper, unsure why she cared enough to give me more work. But I took it home anyway. That night, after dinner and chores, I sat on the floor beside my bed and studied the problems under the dim lamp. The numbers made sense. They followed rules. They never changed without reason. Unlike people. I solved every problem before midnight. The next day, I handed the paper back to her. She reviewed it slowly, her eyebrows lifting higher with every line. "You didn't guess," she said softly. I shook my head. She smiled, not politely, but genuinely. It was the first real smile I had seen in months. From that day forward, she gave me more work, more challenges, more puzzles. Each one pushed me further than the last. And for the first time since the day I was left behind, I felt something shift inside me. Not happiness, not comfort, control. Learning gave me control, and control made survival possible. Years passed quietly after that. Foster homes changed, but routines stayed the same. Pack belongings into a single bag. Memorize new schedules. Learn new rules. Avoid attention unless necessary. I became good at disappearing into systems. Good at adapting. Good at surviving. By middle school, my teachers had begun noticing patterns in my grades. Perfect scores. Consistent performance. No missing assignments. One counselor called me into her office one afternoon. Her office smelled like lavender and paper, a strange combination that made the air feel heavier than usual. She opened a folder and flipped through several documents. My documents. "You've been placed in advanced classes," she said. I didn't react. I had learned to keep my face still, no matter what happened. She leaned forward slightly. "Have you ever thought about college?" The word sounded distant, foreign, like something meant for other people. People with families. People with parents who signed permission slips and attended school meetings. "I don't know," I answered quietly. She studied me for a long moment. Then she reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a brochure. Scholarships. Programs for students without permanent guardians. Opportunities for students in foster care. She placed the brochure in front of me carefully, like it contained something fragile. "You should keep this," she said. I stared at the paper long after leaving her office. Scholarship. Opportunity. Words I had never associated with myself before. That night, back in my room, I unfolded the brochure again. The pages listed requirements, deadlines, expectations, clear rules, clear goals. For the first time, the future didn't feel empty. It felt structured, achievable. Years later, during my final year of high school, I sat alone in the library long after closing hours. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead while stacks of textbooks surrounded me. College applications lay spread across the table. Scholarship essays half finished. Deadlines circled in red ink. I reread each requirement carefully, checking every instruction twice. Nothing could be left incomplete. Not after everything that had already been taken from me. One evening, while reviewing my personal records, I requested a copy of my official identification file from the school office. The clerk handed me a sealed envelope without hesitation. Routine paperwork. Nothing unusual. At least, that's what I expected. Back in the library, I opened the envelope slowly. Paper slid across the table as I reviewed each document one by one. Birth certificate, school history, placement summaries. Then something caught my attention. A line near the bottom of the page, typed in smaller print than the rest. Status, identity classification, restricted. My fingers froze above the paper. Restricted. I had seen that word before, years ago. Inside another office, inside another file. A cold feeling spread slowly through my chest, tightening with every breath. I scanned the document again, carefully. There it was, stamped clearly across the page. Record access level, pending authorization. Authorization from who? Why was my identity restricted? Why had pieces of my history always felt incomplete? The buzzing sound from the overhead lights suddenly grew louder, sharper, pressing into my ears until it felt unbearable. I gathered the papers slowly, sliding them back into the envelope with steady hands. But inside, something had already changed. For years, I believed survival meant staying invisible, following rules, avoiding questions. But now, questions were the only thing that mattered, because deep inside, I felt the same cold certainty that had followed me since childhood. My records weren't missing by accident. They had been hidden, and I had spent my entire life living inside a story someone else had rewritten. By the time I turned 34, I had built a life that looked calm from the outside. My office sat on the 9th floor of a glass building in downtown Denver, high enough to see the mountains when the sky was clear, low enough to still hear traffic humming below like a restless machine. Every morning, I arrived before most people, set my coffee beside my keyboard, and opened files other people wished would stay closed. I was not a lawyer. I was the person lawyers called when the paperwork felt too clean. Corporate compliance investigation was not glamorous. Most days were quiet. Contracts, ledgers, internal emails, transfer histories, signature logs. But quiet things had always spoken loudly to me. I knew what missing pages felt like. I knew how lies hid in empty spaces. One afternoon, during what should have been a routine audit, I found a forged executive signature buried inside a vendor contract. The company had already approved the deal. Everyone else had missed it. But the loop in the capital B was wrong. Too tight. Too controlled. The spacing after the last name was off by less than half an inch. I flagged it immediately. 2 weeks later, my supervisor walked into my office with a look I had seen before. Not shock. Respect. "You just saved them from signing away half their distribution rights," he said. I only nodded. Praise still made me uncomfortable, even after all those years. I had learned long ago not to build a home inside anyone else's approval, but my reputation spread anyway. Senior attorneys started asking for me by name. Companies requested my review before mergers. Executives who barely understood my work shook my hand and told me I had saved them from disaster. One of them said something I never forgot. "You don't just find mistakes, Olivia. You find intentions." Intentions. That was the part most people missed. Mistakes were messy. Intentions were disguised. And I had spent my whole life studying disguise. On a gray Tuesday morning in October, my supervisor, Daniel Price, appeared at my door holding a sealed folder. He usually knocked once and walked in. That morning, he knocked twice. I looked up. Something in his face made my hand pause over the keyboard. "We have a new client," he said. His tone was careful, high profile, sensitive. They specifically asked for someone meticulous. He set the folder on my desk. I didn't open it right away. The paper seal was unbroken. The client name was covered by a white label. Daniel stayed standing, which meant he expected a reaction. "Is there a problem?" I asked. "Maybe," he said. "That's what they're paying us to find out." I slid one finger under the seal and opened the folder. The first page was a formal engagement letter. My eyes moved across the header, then stopped. Bennett Holdings. For a moment, the whole office disappeared, the traffic below, the hum of the lights, Daniel standing in front of me. All of it faded behind that name. Bennett. The name I had stopped saying years ago. The name removed from my records. The name that once belonged to people who left me standing in a law office while they walked away with the children they chose to keep. I closed the folder. Not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to give myself one breath. Daniel watched me. "Do you know them?" The question landed softly, but it cut deep. I could have told him the truth. I could have said yes. That company carried the name of the people who abandoned me. I could have asked to be removed from the case. No one would have blamed me. But the old instinct rose inside me. Observe first. React later. "No," I said. The lie tasted bitter, but necessary. "I can handle it." Daniel studied me for a second longer, then nodded. "There's been suspicious financial movement for years," he said. "Small transfers, hard to trace, nothing big enough alone to trigger panic, but together." He tapped the folder. "Together, it looks deliberate." Years. That word mattered. Not months, not a recent mistake. Years. The same kind of years that had swallowed my childhood whole. After Daniel left, I sat alone with the folder still closed beneath my hand. My reflection stared back faintly from the dark computer screen. 34 years old. Calm face, steady eyes, hair pinned neatly back. A woman trained to read evidence without flinching. But under the surface, the child from that office was wide awake. That evening, when most of the staff had gone home, I reopened the Bennett file. The building had gone quiet. Somewhere down the hall, a printer clicked and hummed, then stopped. The city lights blinked outside my window. I spread the documents across my desk. Financial ledgers, partnership agreements, transfer records, internal approvals. At first glance, everything looked normal. Too normal. Clean paperwork always made me suspicious. I started with the transfers Daniel mentioned, small amounts, repeated quarterly, routed through operational expenses, hidden inside categories no one looked at twice. Maintenance, vendor reconciliation, administrative correction. But money had a rhythm. When the rhythm repeated too perfectly, it stopped feeling accidental. I traced one transfer backward, then another, then another. They all led to a holding account created decades earlier. My pulse slowed. That was how my body reacted to danger. Not racing, slowing, sharpening. The account was inactive now, but not closed. I opened the metadata: creation date, authorized signatories, linked beneficiary field. The screen loaded for 3 seconds. Then the name appeared. Olivia Bennett. Reserved. I stared at it. Reserved. Not removed. Not deleted. Reserved. The word was small, official, almost cold, but it cracked something open inside me. For years, I had lived with records that were incomplete, restricted, missing, altered. For years, I had believed my identity had been erased because I was unwanted. But why would an unwanted child have a reserved account? Why would anyone preserve a name they had tried so hard to bury? I printed the page and held it in my hands. The paper was warm from the machine. My name sat there in black ink, undeniable. Olivia Bennett. Reserved. 2 days later, a letter arrived at my office. No return address. No company marking. Just my name typed neatly across the front. I knew before I opened it that it belonged to the same invisible hand that had followed me through my life. The same hand behind the strange documents. The same silence behind every missing answer. Inside was one sheet of paper, 3 lines. Your name was never removed. It was hidden. Go to the address below if you want to know why. Beneath the message was an address in Colorado Springs. No signature, no explanation. I sat back slowly, the letter trembling slightly between my fingers. For years, I had searched quietly. Now, the truth was reaching back. That night, I stayed in the office long after the janitors had passed through. The Bennett file lay open on my desk. The anonymous letter rested beside it. One was professional. One was personal. Together, they pointed in the same direction. I typed the address into my phone. A private property near the old Bennett headquarters. I saved it. Then I turned off my monitor and sat in the dark for a moment, listening to the quiet. I thought about the girl in the law office, the one who waited 12 seconds for someone to turn around. No one had. But now, years later, a door had opened from the other side, and this time, I was walking through it willingly. The Bennett name looked different when it was made of polished steel. I stood outside the company headquarters in Colorado Springs with the morning sun flashing against the glass walls above me. The letters stretched across the entrance, bold and expensive, the kind of sign meant to tell the world that nothing inside could be touched. Bennett Holdings. For most people, it was a corporation. For me, it was the name missing from school records, social service files, and every form that had ever made me feel like a child without a past. I adjusted the strap of my leather work bag and stepped through the revolving doors. The lobby smelled like marble polish and fresh flowers. A receptionist looked up from behind a curved white desk, her smile professional and practiced. "Good morning. How can I help you?" "Olivia Bennett," I said. "Lead compliance investigator. I'm here for the internal records review." Her smile held for half a second. Then something shifted. Her eyes moved over my face more carefully. Not recognition exactly. More like confusion, as if a memory had brushed against her and disappeared before she could name it. "Of course," she said quickly. "They're expecting you." As she printed my visitor badge, I looked around the lobby. Framed photographs lined the wall beside the elevators. Ribbon cuttings, charity galas, anniversary dinners, executives shaking hands with important people. My father appeared in several of them. Older, silver at the temples, confident smile, perfect suit. The same man who had once guided my brother out of a law office and never looked back. I felt nothing dramatic when I saw his face. No shaking hands, no tears. Just a clean, quiet click inside my mind. "There you are." A young assistant led me through a secured hallway toward the executive conference room. The floors were so polished, I could see the lights reflected beneath my shoes. The walls displayed the family's history in gold-framed photographs. There were pictures of my parents, my sister, my brother, board ceremonies, company retreats, holiday fundraisers. But nowhere, not once, was there any trace of me. Not a childhood photo, not a nameplate, not even a shadow in the background. By then, I didn't feel erased. I felt documented by absence. The assistant opened the conference room door. Several executives sat around a long table, and at the far end sat my father, Richard Bennett. He looked up from a folder. His eyes met mine. The room held still. For 1 second, then two, he stared like a man trying to place a song he had not heard in years. His expression didn't soften. It tightened. Familiarity without welcome. Recognition without admission. "Ms. Bennett," one of the attorneys said, standing. "Thank you for coming." I stepped inside. Of course. My father's gaze stayed on me. I gave him no emotion to read. No fear, no accusation, no child begging to be chosen. Only professionalism. "I'll need full access to internal financial archives, transfer logs, trust records, and executive authorization histories," I said, placing my folder on the table. A man near the window cleared his throat. "That's a broad request." "It's a broad investigation." No one laughed. My father finally spoke. "I assume your firm briefed you on discretion." His voice was deeper than I remembered, but the chill was the same. "They did," I said. "Discretion does not mean obstruction." A small silence followed. That was the first time I saw it. Not guilt. Fear. It flickered across his face and disappeared. By noon, I had a temporary workstation in a glass-walled office overlooking the city. Digital archives were transferred to my secure drive. Boxes of older documents arrived one by one, carried by nervous assistants who avoided lingering. Everything looked perfect at first. That was the problem. Perfect records were rarely innocent. Real companies made harmless mistakes. They mislabeled files. They duplicated invoices. They forgot initials. But Bennett Holdings moved money with surgical cleanliness. Too clean. By late afternoon, I found the first crack. Small transfers hidden under maintenance reimbursements. Then vendor reconciliations. Then administrative corrections. Different labels. Same rhythm. Same approval chain. The authorizing signature belonged to Richard Bennett, my father. I compared the signature against older board documents. Same pressure, same slant, same sharp hook at the end of the last letter. Not forged, approved, repeated for years. I followed the trail deeper. The transfers did not lead to an outside vendor. They led back inward, to a protected internal trust account. My trust account. Olivia Bennett, reserved. My breath slowed as I opened the transfer memo. Maintain until verification complete. Verification. The word appeared again, like a nail driven into the wall of my past. Verification of what? That evening, Bennett Holdings hosted a private executive dinner in a dining room on the top floor. I was expected to attend, not as family, but as the investigator now holding keys to files no one wanted opened. The room glowed with soft lighting and expensive restraint. White tablecloths, crystal glasses, low voices, carefully trained smiles. Then my mother walked in. Eleanor Bennett. She wore a cream suit and pearls, her hair swept back like she had prepared for a photograph. She greeted two board members, touched one woman's arm, laughed politely. Then she saw me. Everything in her face collapsed for half a second. The color drained from her cheeks. Her hand tightened around the stem of her glass. She knew me. Immediately. Absolutely. "My God," she whispered. "Not Olivia. Not my daughter. Not, I'm sorry. Just fear." My father turned sharply toward her, then toward me. His jaw tightened. My mother lowered herself into a chair as though her knees had weakened. Dinner continued, but only on the surface. My father over-explained quarterly performance. My mother avoided looking at me. A board member mentioned the delayed verification matter, then stopped when Richard shot him a glance so sharp it could have cut glass. I set down my fork. There it was again. Verification. After dinner, I returned to the records office alone. The building was almost empty now. My badge clicked against locked doors. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere far below, an elevator opened and closed. I searched the internal archive for the phrase, delayed verification. Only one restricted file appeared. Identity, verification, authorization. Bennett minor case. My hand stayed steady as I opened it. The document loaded slowly, line by line. Case references, legal notes, financial restrictions, inheritance eligibility. My name appeared in the third paragraph, not as a daughter, not as a child, as a subject. Subject to return. I stared at those 3 words. Return. They had not expected me to come back, but they had planned for it. At the bottom of the file was one final notation. Final confirmation pending upon subject's reappearance. The office around me went silent in a way that reminded me of another room, another lifetime, 12 seconds when no one moved. But this time, I was not the child waiting for someone to choose me. I was the woman holding the file they never wanted me to see. And in that moment, I understood the truth was no longer hiding from me. It was daring me to finish what they started. The file opened with a soft click that sounded far louder than it should have. I stood alone in the archive room long after midnight, the fluorescent lights casting sharp shadows across the rows of metal cabinets. Outside the glass wall, the city had gone dark, but inside Bennett Holdings, the truth was just beginning to wake up. The restricted document filled the screen slowly. Legal filings, authorization notes, witness statements, not about vendors, not about finances, about me. My pulse slowed instead of racing. That was how my body handled fear, by becoming sharper, quieter, more focused. I scrolled carefully. Each date matched a year from my childhood, the year I was placed into foster care, the year my school records became restricted, the year my family name disappeared from every official document connected to my life. This wasn't coincidence. It was timing. It was planning. And then I reached the first statement that shifted everything. Inheritance eligibility dispute. Bennett Family Trust. My fingers froze on the mouse. Inheritance. Not custody. Not abandonment. Inheritance. The document continued, its language precise and cold. Subject child holds primary eligibility status pending identity confirmation. Subject child. Me. I leaned back slowly in my chair, letting the words settle into place. For years, I believed my parents walked away because I was inconvenient, unwanted, unnecessary. But now, the truth unfolded differently. They hadn't removed me because they didn't care. They removed me because I mattered too much. I kept reading. Further notes revealed a legal dispute inside the family. Not between strangers, but between blood relatives fighting over control of the company's ownership shares. Control of Bennett Holdings. Control of power. Control of money. And my existence threatened that control. My legal identity had not been erased. It had been suspended, hidden, placed into a dormant state that prevented ownership from transferring until my status could be verified. That was why my records were incomplete, why files had gone missing, why my name had been restricted instead of deleted. Because if my identity remained active, ownership shares would shift. Leadership would change. Power would fracture. At the bottom of the page, 2 signatures stared back at me. Richard Bennett, Eleanor Bennett, my father, My mother. Not separated, not fighting, working together. That realization landed harder than anything else. They had agreed. They had chosen. Together. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the silence wrap around me. Not the silence of abandonment, the silence of clarity. The next morning, I requested an emergency board session. No explanations, no warnings, just authority. The conference room filled quickly. Executives gathered around the long, polished table, their voices low, uncertain. Lawyers whispered to one another, flipping through files they did not yet understand. My parents arrived last. My father walked in first, his expression carved into professional control. My mother followed, her shoulders tight, her movements careful. Neither of them greeted me. Neither of them needed to. The air between us carried years of unfinished truth. I stood at the front of the room and connected my laptop to the projector. The first slide appeared. Financial transfers, quarterly movements, hidden allocations. Murmurs spread around the table. The second slide followed. Trust accounts, authorization chains, restricted inheritance clauses. The murmurs grew louder. My father leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together so tightly the knuckles turned pale. My mother stared at the screen without blinking. Slide after slide. The truth unfolded. Not dramatically, not emotionally, professionally, calmly, precisely, until the final slide appeared. The original inheritance authorization. Stamped, signed, legally binding. My name sat in the center of the page. Olivia Bennett. Primary eligibility status. Still active, still valid. Never removed, only hidden. The room fell completely silent. I stepped forward. "You didn't lose me," I said quietly. My voice didn't shake. "You concealed me." The distinction settled over the room like dust after collapse. A senior attorney cleared his throat. "This documentation," he said slowly, "requires immediate independent review." Legal language replaced emotion. Procedure replaced denial. Within minutes, the board voted to initiate an external audit. Control of several trust structures was frozen. Ownership records were flagged for verification. Justice did not arrive with shouting. It arrived with signatures. My mother finally spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "You were never supposed to come back." Not apology, not regret, fear, still fear. I looked at her for a long moment, not with anger, not with revenge, with clarity. "I didn't come back to destroy you," I said. "I came back to restore myself." No one argued. No one defended. Truth had already done its work. After the meeting ended, the room emptied slowly. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. Papers were gathered. Voices dropped into quiet conversations. Eventually, I stood alone in the boardroom. My name still glowed faintly on the screen. Visible, public, undeniable. For a moment, I remembered that 12-second silence from years ago. The silence when no one turned around. No one chose me. No one stepped forward. Back then, silence meant abandonment. Now, silence meant recognition. Outside the building, morning sunlight filled the streets. People passed by with coffee cups in their hands, unaware that an entire chapter of my life had just closed behind those walls. I walked past the company sign without stopping, without hesitation, because I didn't need validation anymore. Not from them, not from anyone. For years, I believed being left behind meant I didn't matter, but the truth was different. I mattered so much that they feared what I could become. And fear tried to hide me, not erase me. That realization didn't break me. It freed me. If you've ever felt forgotten, if you've ever stood in silence waiting for someone to turn back and choose you, know this. Sometimes the truth isn't lost. It's hidden. waiting for the moment you become strong enough to uncover it. And if this story reminded you of your own journey, of moments when you had to stand alone and build yourself piece by piece, share your thoughts below. Tell your story. Stay with us. And subscribe, because there are more stories ahead. Stories about strength, survival, and the quiet power of people who were never meant to stay invisible.